What would you do? If one day you returned to your old town and found the person you once loved most, sitting begging for money on the very street where you both dreamed of a future together. It was a cold morning in Hawthorne Bend, a small frontier town where time seemed to slow down. Caleb Turner, a man from the West, who had left more than 30 years ago, had returned only for his father's funeral. He expected nothing. He simply thought he would come stay for a day, and then leave as if he had never returned. But then on the dusty windswept government street, Caleb saw a woman sitting with her head bowed on the steps of an old shop. Her hat rested before her, her hands trembled slightly, and her eyes were painfully familiar. That was Margaret Turner, his first love, the girl who once held his hand under the summer sky, who once believed they would leave this town together. Now one person stands firm in life while the other is knocked down by life. No one says anything, no one approaches. And Caleb faced a choice unlike anything the town of Hawthorne Bend had ever seen. Should you help or turn away to save face for both of you, intervene or remain silent to avoid hurting the self-esteem of the woman he once loved? If it were you, would you move forward, or would you keep going, carrying the regret for the rest of your life? Stay with us, because what that man did next left the whole town in stunned silence. If you feel this question resonates with you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can embark on a story that's quiet yet deep enough to linger in our hearts for a long time. The train stopped at Silver Creek on a pale gray afternoon, the late autumn wind sweeping across the old platform like a long sigh of time. Thomas Hale stepped off the train with his worn leather suitcase, slowly, as if afraid to awaken the town that had slept for decades. He had left this place more than 30 years ago, long enough for the dirt roads to become unfamiliar, but never long enough for the memories to fade. Silver Creek is still there. Not bigger, not richer. The low wooden awnings, the general store with its peeling sign, the small diner on the corner that once sold weak coffee and stale bread. All stand still, silent witnesses to a time gone by. Some towns don't change because they don't need to. They just wait for people to return or never return. Thomas stopped in front of the old train station where he had once seen his mother off on a foggy morning. He was young then, believing that leaving was the only way to live differently. Now, with half his hair gray and his shoulders no longer straight, he returned not for a dream but for death. His father has passed away, a man Thomas had never made peace with. The funeral would take place the following morning at the small church at the end of the street, where the wooden pews creaked with every sitting, and where prayers often echoed more than actual voices. Thomas wasn't sure if he should be there. He'd wondered about it all 3 days on the train. But there are returns that don't need compelling reasons. They happen spontaneously, like the quiet pangs of guilt that grow with age. Silver Creek looked at him with a mixture of familiarity and wariness. Some recognized him, or at least the name Hale. Some nodded politely, some turned away, and some gazed a little longer as if trying to remember why that family had once left such a scar on the town's memory. Thomas walked slowly down the main street. Each step echoed dryly, blending with the sound of the wind whistling through the gaps in the wooden planks. He recognized this feeling, the feeling of someone who once belonged here but was no longer considered to be. Some towns never forgive you for leaving. He remembered those words. His father had said them the night Thomas packed his bags to leave Silver Creek. Not angry, not pleading. Just a sentence that fell between them like a stone sinking in water. Thomas didn't understand then, or pretended not to understand. Now he understands. He walked past the old blacksmith shop, now just an abandoned wooden frame. He passed the one-room school where he used to sit in the back row, dreaming of dust-free horizons. Every street corner whispered an old story, and Thomas was a part of most of them. But was the funeral really the only thing that made him return? Thomas asked himself that question as he stood before the only inn still open. Tonight he would sleep in a room that had once belonged to travelers, those who came and went without a trace. Perhaps that was the right place for him now, not entirely an outsider but no longer an insider either. He set his suitcase down, sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the sounds of the town at night. No car horns, no music. Just the wind and somewhere the gentle creaking of wooden doors like an old breath. 30 years is a long enough time for a man to build a different life. Thomas did just that. He acquired land, a farm, and respect elsewhere. But Silver Creek never left him. It only retreated, patiently waiting. And now, as his father lay peacefully in his simple pine coffin, Silver Creek called him back, not with a voice, but with a very old feeling, the feeling that there was something left unsaid, unconfronted, unreleased. Thomas stood up and pulled back the window curtains. The faint yellow light from the main street streamed into the room. He saw his reflection in the glass, older, more tired, but also quieter. Tomorrow he will confront his past. And perhaps tomorrow he will face something else entirely, something he never dared to name but never forgot, because some returns begin with a funeral and lead us to encounters our hearts were never prepared for. The following morning, as the sun touched the wooden eaves of Silver Creek Main Street, Thomas Hale would see an image that would make the entire 30 years he had traveled suddenly shrink to a single glance. Mornings in Dry Willow always begin more slowly than elsewhere. The sunlight is unhurried, filtering through the wooden eaves, gently touching the dusty government street as if afraid to awaken memories lying dormant beneath the ground. Samuel Reed stepped out of the inn, his hat pulled lower than usual, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his thick coat. He had no clear destination. He was simply walking, as one often does when too many things in one's heart remain unnamed. Dry Willow had changed, but not much. It was still the same street, the same old grocery store with its frosted glass windows, the same small post office with its wooden bulletin board displaying yellowed scraps of paper. Everything looked like an old photograph left out in the sun for too long. Samuel walked slowly, letting his worn boots touch the pavement as if each step were an excuse. Then he saw her. Initially it was just a figure huddled against the brick wall of an old tailor shop, one that had closed years ago. A woman head bowed low, a worn shawl covering almost her entire face. In front of her was a dented tin can tilted on the floor. No invitation, no pleading gaze. Just the silent presence of someone accustomed to being seen through. Samuel decided to move on. He had learned not to stare for too long at such scenes. Not because he was cold-hearted, but because he understood that feeling, the feeling of being looked at with more pity than respect. But at that moment the woman lifted her head, just for a moment, just one glance, and the whole street seemed to stand still. Samuel stood still. He didn't move forward. He didn't move backward. He didn't breathe any harder. He just stood there like someone who had just heard their name called from afar in an old dream. Those eyes, wet, hidden in wrinkles and shadows, still held something heartbreakingly familiar. Clara Whitman. The name echoed in his mind without sound. The girl who had sat beside him on the church steps when they were 17. The one who had laughed so softly, as if afraid the world would hear. The one who had believed that if they tried long enough, they could leave Dry Willow and live a different life. Now she sat there, thin, her shoulders hunched, whether from the cold or from shame, Samuel wasn't sure. Her brown dress had been mended several times at the hem. Her hands rested on her lap, trembling slightly, not from illness but from having to be seen in this state. Samuel felt a tightness in his throat. Some encounters don't come with hugs. They come with silence. He looked around. No one was paying attention. Dry Willow was used to such sights. A woman sitting and begging for money wasn't something that would make the town stop. But for Samuel that moment felt like a silent collision between two lives, heading in opposite directions. He left. She stayed. Samuel thought of his own hands, thick, strong, accustomed to signing papers, buying and selling land and construction. Then he looked at Clara's hands, thin, dry, as if accustomed to clinging to things about to slip from her grasp. He didn't know what he should do. If I move forward, will it only bring her more shame? If I turn away, will it be a belated betrayal? Clara said nothing. She didn't raise the can either. She just glanced at him very quickly, then lowered her head again as if that glance had been an accidental mishap. Samuel realized that it hurt more than any plea. He stood there for a few seconds, or perhaps a few minutes. Time in moments like these is no longer measured by clocks. It is measured by heartbeats, by uninvited memories. He remembered the last time they saw each other. It was on this same street. Clara stood under the shade of an old maple tree holding a small suitcase. Samuel said he needed to leave, needed to become a man strong enough to return. Clara nodded. She always nodded like that. as if believing that waiting was a natural thing. Samuel never came back. Not until today. A coin fell into the tin can near Clara. It wasn't Samuel's, a passerby's. A faint metallic clang echoed, but it was enough to startle Samuel. He realized he was holding his breath. He placed his hand on his breast pocket, where the pocket watch rested. A gift from his father. The only thing he carried with him from the past. He thought about bending down, saying something, anything. But words at this moment seemed too harsh. In the end, Samuel only did one small thing. He took off his gloves and placed them neatly on the nearby windowsill. Then he walked away. Don't look back. It's not that he doesn't care. It's because he knows there are moments that need to be left alone, at least during the first meeting. As Samuel turned into the narrow alley, he stopped, resting his forehead against the cold brick wall. His breath trembled very slightly. No one noticed. And he knew, from that moment on, this return was no longer simple. Dry Willow had just posed a question to him. A question with no room for circumlocution. And as Samuel Reed left that street, carrying with him the image of Clara Whitman's trembling hands, he understood that the most painful thing was not who she had become, but the question he was forced to confront next. Why, with the same beginning, did two people end up with such different fates? The afternoon descended upon Stone Ridge in a pale yellowish light, like a thin layer of dust covering the old wooden roofs. Caleb Monroe sat alone on the steps of the town bank office, his hat beside him, his hands clasped together. He could no longer see the street before him, though his eyes were open. What was in his mind now were two roads beginning at the same point, then silently diverging. Caleb knew exactly who he was in Stone Ridge's eyes. A successful man, a stable landowner, a name spoken with respect, sometimes admiration. People greeted him with a firm nod. They made way for him on the main street. Caleb Monroe was believed to be proof that leaving this small town had been the right choice. But it was at what was considered the pinnacle of success that Caleb felt a silent void gnawing at him. Just a few streets away, Eleanor Price was living a life that Stone Ridge had learned to ignore. She wasn't a beggar, nor was she a criminal. She was simply a woman who had slipped out of the town's spotlight and been left behind. Caleb didn't need to look back at the scene from this morning to know that. The image of Eleanor huddled on the porch of the old bakery, her eyes downcast, her thin shoulders trembling slightly, was etched into his memory like a permanent mark. He realized that the most painful truth wasn't poverty, but the way people walked past her as if she were part of a wooden wall or a lamppost too old to be repaired. Two people, born in Stone Ridge, dreaming of a future beyond the barren hills. And now two destinies stand at opposite ends of the spectrum of perception. Caleb bowed his head, looking down at his carefully polished leather boots. They reflected the sunset light, clean and sturdy. He remembered Eleanor's shoes, worn heels dark in color, patched with rough stitches. Not because she was careless, but because life hadn't given her many choices. He wondered, what brought them here? It's not just about money. It's not just about luck. Caleb recalled his early years. The same classroom. The same evening spent listening to music in the small auditorium. The same innocent promise that if they tried hard enough, the world would open up to them. But when the time came, only one person left. Caleb left with the belief that he needed to become a man worthy of the future. Eleanor stayed not because she lacked dreams, but because she had too many burdens to bear. Family, duty, responsibilities that no one else can take on. Caleb never thought his choice was selfish. And perhaps it wasn't wrong. But looking at Eleanor now, he began to understand that every choice, however necessary, comes with a price. And the one who pays the price isn't always the one who makes the decision. Caleb stood up, walked a few steps toward the end of the street, then stopped. He could do so much. He could talk to Eleanor. He could offer help. He could use his power and reputation to shield her from the harsh gaze of Stone Ridge. But he didn't do it. Because one question kept echoing in his mind: if I speak, do I shame her more? If I speak up, will I hurt her even more? Caleb understood that feeling perfectly. The feeling that kindness, if misplaced, can become a knife. The feeling that public acts of help can strip a person of the last thing they have left, their self-respect. Eleanor didn't need to be saved. She needed to be respected. And that's what tormented Caleb. Stone Ridge isn't malicious, but it's accustomed to categorizing people. Those who succeed are seen. Those who fail gradually fade into the background. Caleb used to be on the visible side, and now he realizes that's not always an honor. He remembered Eleanor's gaze when they had accidentally met that morning. No reproach, no pleading. Just a brief recognition, as if they both understood that time had passed them in very different ways. Caleb felt a heavy weight spreading through his chest. Not mere guilt, but a profound self-reflection, the kind that only comes to those who have lived long enough to look back on their journey. If he had stayed that day, would Eleanor have been different? If Eleanor had left, would she be standing where he is standing now? There is no answer. Only this reality exists. One person is respected, one person is forgotten, and both share a past that can never be rewritten. The sun was setting over Stone Ridge. Caleb adjusted his hat and walked in the fading light. He understood that from this moment on he could no longer live as before, not because Eleanor needed him, but because he himself needed to confront the true meaning of what he had achieved. Being rich isn't about owning more than others. Rather, it's about understanding what we owe to life. And as Caleb Monroe walked through the Stone Ridge sunset, old memories of a time when they both believed the future was something they could grasp together began to return slowly but unstoppably. There are memories that don't need to be named. They return on their own when people are too tired to resist. That night at Meadow Creek, Jonah Whitaker couldn't sleep. He sat by the window of his small boarding house watching the moonlight spill over the faded meadow. The wind blew slowly, carrying the scent of dry earth and weeds, the scent of years gone by but never truly leaving him. Jonah closed his eyes, and as always, the past found him before he could escape. Meadow Creek was young back then. The roads were unpaved, just ruts marked by horse-drawn carriage wheels. The town lived off fragile harvests, and the belief that tomorrow would be better than today, though there was no guarantee. Jonah was then in his early 20s, thin, tall, his gaze always fixed on the distance towards the new railroad lines rumored to open up a whole new world. Rosemary Bell often sat beside him on the grassy hill south of town. They didn't need to say much. Just sit there watching the sun set behind the hills, letting the light bathe everything in golden light, both dreams and innocence. They once believed that leaving Meadow Creek was inevitable, that loving each other was enough, that time would always be there for them. Jonah spoke of new lands where men could build something with their own hands. He said he needed to go, not to leave, but to return as a worthy man. Rosemary listened, smiling faintly. It wasn't exactly a smile of agreement, but of acceptance, because Rosemary understood the things Jonah had never said. That he feared staying would make him feel small. That he feared he wouldn't be able to protect anyone if he remained in this place forever. As for Rosemary, she had different fears. Her family needed someone to stay. Her mother was frail, and her two younger siblings weren't old enough to take over the farm. Meadow Creek didn't allow Rosemary to dream for too long. Duty kept her grounded, even when her heart longed to leave. They talked about the future as if it were a house they would build together. But both avoided mentioning the most important question: who would be the first to stay? Jonah remembered that last evening very clearly. The sky was unusually high and clear. There were so many stars that it made one believe the universe was on their side. They stood under the old oak tree where clumsy letters had once been carved into its trunk. Jonah said he would come back. Rosemary nodded. They both believed in the way young people believe, unconditionally. Now, as that memory returned, Jonah opened his eyes. The room was low and silent. No more starry sky. No more soft laughter. Only a man who had lived long enough to understand that some promises are never broken. They are only stretched by time, to the point where they can no longer retain their original form. Those were the years we thought time was endless. Jonah exhaled slowly. He didn't blame the past, nor did he blame Rosemary, because he knew neither of them had done anything wrong. They had only done the best they could at the time with what they had. Jonah left Meadow Creek and built a remarkable life for himself. He became a respected figure in other towns. But those years could never erase the image of Rosemary standing on the grassy hill, her dress fluttering in the breeze, her eyes filled with both hope and resignation. And Rosemary, she stayed bearing the burden of years that went unnoticed. Not because she was weak, but because there are people who are strong in a very quiet way. They choose to stay so that others can go. Jonah realized this later than he expected, when enough time had passed for every choice to reveal its true cost. The memory lingers on a very small detail: Rosemary's hand resting on his hand that night. Not a tight grip, not a clinging hold, just a touch long enough to say, "I understand." Jonah opened his eyes again. The wind was still blowing outside. Meadow Creek was still there, older, quieter. He understood that the promises made under the old sky hadn't vanished. They had simply become a part of who he was, silently shaping every step he took afterward. And it was those promises, though never fulfilled, that brought them to where they are today. But as Jonah Whitaker let the past settle in the Meadow Creek night, he could not have known that the period of Rosemary Bell's life that had passed after the day he left had not been peaceful, but had begun a quiet, gradual decline. Some lives don't fall apart in a single day. They crumble little by little, so slowly that outsiders don't notice, and those involved don't have time to cry for help. In Hearthstone Valley, Abigail Moore is still referred to as a woman who once had a good family. That sounds comforting, but it's actually the end of any further interest, because in these frontier towns, a good past doesn't protect anyone from a harsh present. Abigail once believed she had made the right choice. She married Henry Moore, a hard-working, quiet man who worked at a railroad warehouse. They weren't rich, but they had enough to live on. In the early years, their small log cabin was filled with laughter, the smell of freshly baked bread, and 2 children growing up amidst sunny mornings. Then things started to go wrong, not with a single fall, but with small slips. Henry borrowed money. At first, to repair the roof, then to buy more tools, then to wait for a big shipment. Each time he would say, "Just this once." And Abigail believed him. Not blindly, but because she understood the feeling of a man cornered by circumstances. As the debts piled up, Henry changed. He became less talkative. He couldn't sleep. He drank more than necessary to forget his failures. Abigail didn't tell anyone. In Hearthstone Valley, people weren't accustomed to talking about family matters, especially things that could damage their reputation. Then Henry died. Not because of a major accident, not because of a tragedy that the town gathered to mourn. He died on a cold night. His heart stopped beating after months of exhaustion. As they carried him out of the house, Abigail stood by the door, not weeping. She had wept enough in nights when no one could hear her. The funeral passed quickly. Handshakes, familiar condolences. And then the town returned to its normal rhythm of life, leaving Abigail standing alone before a list of things she had to pay. The first people to arrive were the general store owner, then the local bank, then the doctor. No one produced the full documentation. No one explained clearly. Just short statements, more of a moral than a legal basis. Her husband is in debt. Her family should take responsibility. Everyone must keep their word. Abigail listened. She nodded. She was used to nodding. But deep down she knew perfectly well many of those accounts weren't in her name. No contracts. No signatures. Just an unspoken understanding that a wife had to pay the price for her husband's choices, even after his death. She sold off the little things in the house. The wooden table Henry had made himself. The old wall clock. The only dairy cow. But debts don't disappear. They just change form like shadows as the sun moves. What hurt Abigail the most wasn't the money. It was how people looked at her afterward. No longer the gentle Mrs. Moore. Instead, she's the woman in debt, a designation enough to make every gaze turn colder. The doctor refused to examine the youngest child unless the old loan was fully repaid. The bank hinted that the house could be foreclosed on if there was no good faith. No one raised their voice. No one made direct threats. But it was precisely this politeness that made everything so suffocating. Abigail began to understand something that only those who have lived long enough truly grasp. Injustice rarely appears in a menacing face. It often comes in the guise of rules and routine. She worked harder, doing laundry for others, cooking for other families, waking up before dawn and going to sleep with trembling hands. But no matter how hard she tried, she was always slower than the invisible circle closing in. Hearthstone Valley isn't evil, but it wasn't built to protect the weak. Abigail didn't break down in tears. She broke down in silence. In the way she began calculating each meal, in the way she avoided eye contact, in the way she learned that honor once questioned is very difficult to maintain. And then one day, when she realized she had no other choice, Abigail understood that this silent, prolonged collapse was not just hers alone. It was the result of a system accustomed to shifting burdens onto shoulders that could no longer resist. And it was during those months when Abigail Moore tried to keep things from falling apart that two little souls were forced to grow up faster than their age, quietly witnessing a world they were never prepared to face. In Willow Bend, mornings often begin with the wind rustling through the slender aspen trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and dry grass. Edmund Carter stood outside his small log cabin on the edge of town, hat in hand, unworn. He wasn't in a hurry to knock. There are places where one must enter slowly, as if afraid of disturbing something fragile within. The door opened, revealing a girl of about 12, Hannah Carter, bright but not innocent eyes, her hair neatly braided, almost impeccably so for her age. She looked at Edmund, her head slightly bowed. "Sir, my mother is in the back. I'll call her." It wasn't a simple, "Hello, uncle." It wasn't, "Come in, sir." It was just a polite, carefully worded phrase, like that of someone accustomed to speaking in front of elders. He felt a tightness in his chest. Inside, the younger boy Jacob was sitting at a wooden table wiping a chipped porcelain cup. When he saw Edmund, he quickly stood up, wiping his hands on his shirt. "Hello, Grandpa," he said, his voice low but clear. "Would you like some water?" Edmund didn't answer immediately. He looked at the two children, the way they stood, the way they waited, the way they observed the adults' expressions to guess what to say next. There was no innocent curiosity, no childlike sloppiness, only caution. Such caution should not be present in children like this. Hannah poured the water, holding the pitcher tightly with both hands, as if afraid of spilling it. Jacob placed the glass in front of Edmund, then stepped back, half a pace, a small distance, but one that carried a long-standing habit. Edmund remembered himself at 12 years old. He remembered running barefoot in the meadows, being scolded for breaking things, and the feeling of being allowed to make mistakes. But these two children, they acted as if every move had to be right, because making mistakes was a luxury they weren't allowed to have. Hannah spoke first on behalf of her mother. "My mother is a little tired today, but she told me that if you come, I must treat you well." Edmund nodded. He understood. Children who grow up in poverty often learn to speak for their parents, saying what adults need to hear. Not because they like it, but because they're afraid of causing more trouble. When their mother appeared, Edmund was ready. But what caught him off guard was the way the two children silently observed his every word and gesture, as if assessing whether this man posed a risk. Hannah asked about the weather. Jacob asked if he needed more water. Those were polite questions. Too polite. Edmund realized he was clutching his hat tightly in his hand. He exhaled slowly, not out of anger but out of a deep sorrow that required time to compose himself. They are not poor because they lack money, he thought. They are poor because they lack carefree years. No one taught Hannah to understand things that way. No one taught Jacob to be so polite, even to the point of being wary. It was the result of days spent watching adults worry, fear, and choose between things no child should ever know. Tang bent down to be at Jacob's level. "How old are you?" he asked, his voice gentle. 9 years old, sir," he replied immediately, without hesitation. "What do you like to play?" Jacob was silent for a moment. Then he answered very softly, "I don't play much. I help my mother. It's not that he doesn't want to play. It's that he doesn't dare to want to." Hannah stood beside him, clutching the hem of her dress. She looked at her brother, then at Edmund, as if afraid he might ask something else that might cause Jacob to say something wrong. That moment, very brief, was enough for Edmund to understand that these two children had learned to protect each other better than adults. Edmund stood up straight. He looked around the house, neat, clean, but lacking any trace of a child. No toys scattered around. No drawings plastered on the walls, just the necessary orderliness to prevent anything from falling apart again. He realized he was angry, not with their mother, not with the town itself, and there is an invisible order that has placed children under the responsibility of tasks meant for adults. Edmund said nothing more. He made no promises. He didn't pat anyone on the head. He just stood there listening, observing, and taking in every detail like a man who had lived long enough to understand that the right thing to do doesn't need to be announced immediately. When he left, Hannah saw him to the door. "Thank you for coming," she said. "My mother told me to say that." Edmund stopped and turned to look at her. "No," he said slowly. "You don't have to say anything." Hannah was stunned. For a very brief moment her eyes wavered as if she were unsure whether she had just been granted permission or had something taken away from her. Edmund put on his hat and stepped outside. The wind at Willow Bend was blowing harder. He understood that from this moment on he could no longer stand outside. Because when a man sees children being forced to grow up too soon, it's no longer just a family matter. It's a cry that conscience cannot ignore. And it was from that quiet morning in Willow Bend that Edmund Carter began doing what he did best, not with words, but with quiet actions, discreet enough to preserve the dignity of people who had never been properly protected. As evening fell over Cedar Hollow, the setting sun cast a warm, golden hue over the main street and the low wooden awnings, both weathered and comforting. Gideon Shaw walked past the long closed shops, his heavy leather shoes scraping against the fine dust of the pavement. He carried a brown paper bag containing papers and a few coins. He had no intention of stopping, and no one knew he had come here to the small house on the edge of town where Abigail Moore and her 2 children lived. He knew all too well in Cedar Hollow everyone looked at each other with suspicion, and stories of quiet kindness rarely lasted long. All they saw was a thin woman, her shoulders hunched with weariness, her eyes deep with worry, and 2 children who had grown up too quickly. Everyone thought Abigail was alone, but Gideon knew that alone didn't fully capture the silent suffering she endured, and he had come to do something but not to show off. He stepped into the backyard as light as the wind and placed the paper bag on the windowsill. No call, no warning, just a sign that things would get a little better quietly, silently. The debts Abigail hadn't paid, the undocumented bills, the unfair demands from the doctor or the shop, Gideon had sorted them out. He knew that if Abigail saw him, she would refuse to help, for her burning pride was stronger than her need. He turned back, standing on the steps, watching the 2 children sitting on the old wooden bench, whispering to each other. Hannah bowed her head as she spoke, while Jacob listened quietly, his eyes shining with a maturity beyond his years. Gideon felt a lump in his throat, a lump both warm and painful. He realized that the greatest poverty wasn't a lack of money, but a childhood forced to mature before it was ready. He walked out silently without a word. No one knew, no one witnessed it, except for the birds on the roof and the silent poplar trees. And he knew that this silence was the only way to preserve Abigail's dignity and that of the 2 children. He didn't want anyone to think she needed saving, because she didn't. She needed respect, silence enough to allow her to retain control of her own life. Gideon recalled the days when he himself was young, learning that the most important actions don't need to be ostentatious. His father had once said, "A truly good man doesn't need to show off. Others will notice." He smiled silently, emphasizing that kindness isn't about scoring points, but about saving important things that go unnoticed. He turned to look at Abigail. She sat on the bench, her back slightly hunched, her hands carefully arranging old papers. Not a word, not a pleading look. Gideon understood that her silence was part of the strength he respected. He took a deep breath and nodded slightly, as if to say, "I've arranged everything." But only he knew. No words were spoken. The children giggled softly as they played together, but their eyes occasionally glanced at him. Not out of curiosity, but as if recognizing something greater than their age, a mirror of quiet perseverance. Edmund had once said, "Children are the most powerful emotional blows." And now Gideon understood that it was the way the 2 children looked at him without a word that had made his heart ache, making him want to protect them yet keep his distance. He left the yard, stepping down the dusty path, the setting sun casting a warm blanket over his shoulders. No one knew what he had done. No one spoke of it. But he knew today these people, Abigail, Hannah, Jacob, would not have to endure another difficult night. And that was all he needed. No boasting, no thanks. Just quietly fulfilling his duty as a man in the way he understood right. And as Gideon Shaw left the log cabin on that golden afternoon, he had no idea that the house would soon resound with familiar sounds once again, laughter, and the vibrant sounds of the past about to return, with secrets that only time would reveal. The afternoon in Pine Hollow descended slowly, as if this small town were accustomed to letting time pass by cautiously. Nathaniel Brooks stopped his horse before the log cabin at the end of the gravel road, where weeds grew knee-high and the white hedge had turned gray from rain and sun. He dismounted, standing still for a long time as if to make sure he was in the right place. That house was once the center of my entire childhood. It was called Brooks' house, though no one had lived there for years. The roof sagged slightly at the west corner where snow had once weighed heavily during winters. The front window had a thin crack, the mark of a lost ball and laughter that had been carried away by the wind. Nathaniel pushed the door open. The hinges creaked softly, not resentfully, but like a weary greeting. Inside, the house was emptier than he remembered. No tables or chairs, no curtains, only the empty spaces where memories once resided. He stepped into the living room. The afternoon light streamed through the window, illuminating the worn wooden floor, revealing old scratches, small footprints, tracing circles the evenings the family gathered around the fireplace. Nathaniel stood there, and in the silence he heard sounds that no longer existed. Children's laughter, the clinking of spoons against bowls, someone calling someone's name from the kitchen. The houses don't forget. They only fall silent when no one asks about them anymore. Nathaniel gently removed his hat and placed it on the windowsill. He wasn't a nostalgic person, but here everything forced him to slow down. He remembered Eliza Brooks, the little girl who used to run through this living room, her dress billowing, her eyes as bright as the morning sun. Eliza grew up here, learning to cook, learning to be considerate, learning to stay when others left. Nathaniel left Pine Hollow at a very young age. Eliza did not. He walked into the kitchen, where the lost wooden ladle used to hang. On the east wall, a fainter patch of light remained where a picture frame used to hang, where a family had once stood close together. Nathaniel placed his hand on the wall, feeling the cold wood. He wasn't seeking forgiveness in this house. He just wanted to do the right thing in the least hurtful way possible. The house has been bought. The paperwork is complete. No fuss. No attention-grabbing intermediaries. Nathaniel did it, as he always did other important things, discreetly, properly, and without leaving a trace. He didn't want Pine Hollow to gossip. He didn't want Eliza to be subjected to the curious gaze of the townspeople. He understood perfectly well that some gifts, if seen, would become a burden. He placed the leather briefcase on the empty kitchen counter and opened it. Inside was a stack of papers neatly bound with a thin string. Eliza's name was written clearly in firm, unpretentious handwriting. Nathaniel reread each line, not out of doubt but out of respect. Each signature represented an irreversible decision. He stood there in the empty house and realized the gentle paradox of hope it often comes with loss. For to give back a home he had to confront the truth that the years spent there were gone forever. The old laughter could not be recovered. The long evenings could not be returned. Only another morning could be opened if the recipient was willing to step inside. Nathaniel walked down the narrow corridor leading to the small bedroom at the back. The room was empty, but the wooden floor was less worn. He remembered Eliza sleeping in this corner near the window. On hot summers the window would be open and the breeze would carry the scent of pine and hay. Nathaniel stood still, closing his eyes, letting the memory gently touch him before fading away. He didn't stay long. Things like this don't need an audience. Before leaving, he placed the new key on the kitchen counter next to a stack of papers. The key was shiny, a comfortable weight enough to open a door, but not enough to open a heart if the holder wasn't ready. Outside, the afternoon light had turned amber. Nathaniel stepped out onto the porch, closing the door this time more gently. He turned away without looking back, not because he didn't care, but because he knew the rest was not his concern. On the way home, Nathaniel thought of Eliza. He thought about how she would stand in the empty house, hearing the old sounds, and having to decide whether she had the courage to accept a belated hope. He thought of Pine Hollow, a town that wasn't evil but was accustomed to judging things that weren't its own. And somewhere within him a quiet intuition arose. Actions performed in silence rarely end in silence. Kindness, once it touches the heart, can awaken the deepest conflicts. And as Eliza Brooks is about to take the key, Pine Hollow will force them both to confront the hardest thing. Not whether to accept it or not, but how to maintain their self-respect amidst ever-present, unwavering gazes. News at Ashford Crossing always spreads faster than the wind. No loudspeakers, No letters. Just a sideways glance, a whisper behind a counter, and the whole town knows something's not right. So, when Margaret Sloane picked up the stack of papers on the old kitchen table, the house ownership papers, she understood immediately the silence of the previous days was over. That house, the wooden house at the end of the tree-lined street, where she grew up, where there was laughter, then tears, and finally only suffering. Margaret thought she had closed that chapter, yet now it lay before her in neat, legitimate, undeniable words. She didn't need to read the whole thing to know who was behind this. Silas Bennett. The man returned to Ashford Crossing with a calm, unassuming demeanor, seeking no attention, and precisely because of this he was more dangerous than any show-off. Silas did everything right. Too right. To the point that Margaret had nowhere to hide. When he entered the kitchen, she was already standing there, back straight, hands resting on the countertop, her eyes unwavering. "He has no right," she said without beating around the bush. Silas paused. He didn't immediately retort. He simply took off his hat, placed it on the chair, and then looked up at her, his gaze somber, neither defensive nor apologetic. "I'm not doing this for power," he replied. "I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do." Margaret chuckled softly. Not amused, not sarcastic, just the laugh of someone who had heard that phrase too many times in their life. "In this town," she said slowly, "people always say, 'It needs to be done.' But then it's never them who live with the consequences." The air in the kitchen thickened. Outside the window, the wind whistled through the bare trees. Ashford Crossing was listening, as every small town does, even when no one is standing there. Silas took another step, then stopped. He understood this boundary perfectly. He understood that if he crossed it, he would no longer be a helper, but an arbitrator. "I didn't tell anyone," he said. "Nobody knows." Margaret spun around. "Do you think that's enough?" Her voice rose but didn't break. "Do you think just keeping it a secret will do here? They don't need papers to judge. Just knowing I'm still standing is enough for them to leave me alone. But if they think I'm being provided for—" She paused. Not because she lacked words, but because the word was too heavy. "Then I would lose everything." Silas was silent. He had anticipated this reaction. But when it came, his chest still tightened. Not because of rejection, but because he understood Margaret wasn't rejecting the house. She was protecting the last thing she had left, her honor. "I didn't buy it for you," he said slowly. "I'm returning what belongs to you." Margaret shook her head. "There is no return without leaving a trace," she replied. "You didn't live here all the years I was seen as a failure. You don't understand what it feels like to have every step weighed. I've learned to stand on my own 2 feet, and I wouldn't trade that for a home, even if it once was mine." Her words were sharp but not malicious. They were honed by years of endurance, not by momentary anger. Silas took a deep breath. He wasn't angry, but he wasn't backing down either. "There are times," he said, "when standing alone isn't courage, it's exhaustion." Margaret looked at him. For a long time. Her gaze held no hatred, only weariness. "Do you think I don't know that?" she asked. "I know exactly what price I have to pay every day to avoid bowing my head. But if I accept even just once, I will no longer be myself. I will become their story." They stood there facing each other. Neither raised their voice, neither cried, but the room felt cramped as their two contrasting philosophies of life clashed. Silas believed in action. Margaret believed in limits. Silas believed that making amends was a responsibility. Margaret believed that accepting help could destroy a person. No one is wrong, and no one wins. Finally, Silas nodded. "Okay," he said. "I won't force you." Margaret didn't say thank you. She didn't apologize either. She just turned away, gathered the papers, put them in a drawer, and locked it, not to keep them but to temporarily avoid facing them. Silas put on his hat and walked towards the door. Before leaving, he paused. "If one day," he said, "you need not the house, but another way, I'll still be here." Margaret didn't turn around, but her hands gripped the armrests of the chair tightly. As the doors closed, Ashford Crossing breathed a sigh of relief. The confrontation was over, but its repercussions would last for a long time. Because self-respect, once touched, doesn't go out. It burns smoldering persistently and can consume even the best things if no one is patient enough to stand beside that flame. And as Silas Bennett left the cabin in silence, he began to understand that there are people who don't need to be saved. They need to be loved in a way that respects their limitations, even if that requires patience even harder than sacrifice. Night fell slowly over Ridgewater. The oil lamps in the windows cast tiny golden specks enough to let one know that someone was still awake, thinking, contemplating, taking responsibility for things unspoken. Thomas Alder sat on the steps of the inn, his hands on his knees, silently gazing down the deserted main street. He had left Clara Winslow's kitchen with many things left unnamed, and it was this unnamed state that weighed heavily on his heart. Clara remained in her old house not because she wanted to, but because it was where she knew how to stand firm. She cleaned very slowly, as if each item carried a memory that needed to be properly bid farewell. When she placed the kettle on the stove, she paused, watching the trembling blue flame. Fire, like people, burns too strongly. If too weak, it goes out. Maintaining just the right balance is an art. Thomas understood fire in a different way. He believed that what is broken should be fixed. What is cracked should be repaired. What is missing should be compensated for. Life taught him this through droughts, ruined farms, and people pulled from the brink by a timely decision. For Thomas, love was action. It was making tomorrow easier than today. It was standing up when you could stand up. Clara understands life in a different way. She believed that existence meant maintaining one's identity amidst pressures that sought to distort it. It meant not allowing self-respect to be compromised even at the cost of exhaustion. It meant living with what one had, one's hands, one's endurance, and a quiet belief that freedom wasn't always about noise. They met again the following morning under the post office's awning. No appointment, no avoidance, just two familiar paths leading to the same place. Thomas spoke first, his voice low and undefensive. "I didn't come here to persuade anyone." Clara nodded. She didn't look at him, her eyes fixed on the road where the wind whipped dust into small swirls. "That's good then," she said. "I'm tired of explaining." They stood side by side, close enough to hear each other's breath, far enough not to touch. Thomas looked at Clara's hands, calluses, tiny cracks, evidence of a lifetime of self-reliance. He felt respect, and at the same time, an urge to do more. "I fix what I can," Thomas said, as if talking to himself. "Not because I think I'm better than anyone else, but because I've seen what happens when nobody else fixes." Clara turned and looked at him. Her gaze wasn't harsh, but it was sharp. "As for me," she replied, "I live on what I have. Not because I hate helping, but because I know that once I accept, I'll be indebted. And in Ridgewater, debt is never just money." Thomas remained silent. He knew it. He had seen the looks, the whispers, the labels attached to others. He also knew that kindness misplaced could become a pretext for judgment. "Honor is not about standing alone," he said slowly. "Honor is not turning away when you can do what is right." Clara shook her head very gently. "My honor," she said, "is not to let anyone else decide who I am, not even a kind person." The atmosphere between them became tense, not out of anger but because their values clashed. Thomas thought of the times he had repaired roofs for others, paid off debts for someone, and quietly arranged for things to continue. For him, it was the responsibility of someone capable. For Clara, it was a boundary to maintain, to avoid being swallowed up. They walked a short distance side by side. Their steps were even unhurried. Thomas spoke of winters when he had seen people lose everything because they lacked a helping hand at the right time. Clara spoke of mornings when she had to stand tall under suspicious gazes just to maintain her own autonomy. "He calls it love," Clara said. "I call it interference." Thomas didn't argue. He just asked, "What if one day what she has isn't enough?" Clara paused. She looked up at the low hill to the north where the dry grass swayed in the wind. "Then I'll find another way," she said, "but it will be my way." Thomas understood, and it was precisely when he understood that he found it harder than being rejected. Because loving in his own way isn't necessarily loving in the way the other person needs, and respect sometimes requires doing less, not more. They stood there, each holding their rightful place. No one retreated, no one advanced, but something shifted very subtly in the way they looked at each other. Thomas realized that responsibility wasn't just about fixing things, it was also about waiting for the right moment. Clara realized that independence didn't necessarily mean loneliness. "We are different," Thomas said. "Yes," Clara replied, "but not the opposite." The wind blows through Ridgewater carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Towns like this survive because of the people who don't leave and those who return and learn to stay without being overbearing. They parted ways at a crossroads, no promises, no hasty compromises. Just an acknowledgement. Love isn't about fixing everything, nor is it about surviving at all costs. Love is about learning to stand beside someone, close enough to listen yet far enough away not to hurt. Thomas walked more slowly. Clara returned home, her back straighter. Both carried unanswered questions, and that's what kept the story going. But as the two learned to respect each other's boundaries, Ridgewater begins to murmur, for in towns that never sleep quiet, kindness is often misunderstood before it is understood. In Clearwater Junction, night isn't really night. The pub lights go out early, the church closes, but the town remains awake in whispers, escaping through half-closed windows in exchanged glances on the main street, in the way people know about things before they happen. Rumors have no specific form. They don't need a name for the person who spreads them. They just need a place to start, a stall, a doorstep, a vague remark. And then, like the wind across the meadow, they travel everywhere without leaving a trace. People are talking about Evelyn Hart. It started off quietly. "Has anyone seen Mr. Miles visit her house? I heard he was helping her with some debts." Then she grew older. "It seems she's being financially supported." Living like that as a widow, what would people think? Evelyn didn't hear it directly, but she sensed it. In the way the shopkeeper stopped talking when she entered. In the averted gaze at the church. In the sudden politeness, a politeness usually reserved for those about to be weighed on the scales. She began to withdraw into herself. Not because of fear, but because of exhaustion. She drew the curtains earlier. She went to the market during off-peak hours. She avoided places where she might encounter many people. And then, with the decision that weighed most heavily on her heart, Evelyn sent the two children to stay with her cousin in Pine Creek, not because she didn't love them, but because she wanted to protect them from things children shouldn't hear. "Just for a while," she said, her voice so calm that she didn't even notice the tremor. When the carriage carrying the children left Clearwater Junction, Evelyn stood on the porch for a long time. The town remained quiet. No one came to see them off. No one inquired. The silence weighed more heavily than any accusation. At the other end of town, Miles Rowan began to notice the change. He noticed Evelyn was rarely around. He noticed the doors of her house closing early. He noticed the strange looks when he entered the diner, no longer curiosity but scrutiny. Clearwater Junction was piecing everything together into a more understandable story. A man offering help, a woman receiving it, and a predetermined conclusion. Miles wasn't used to that. He had lived his whole life by a simple principle: if it could be fixed, then fix it. If it could be borne, then bear it. No need for anyone to know. No need for recognition. But now he began to wonder, was his kindness hurting others? He remembered every action, every arrangement, every time he tried to keep things secret. But Clearwater Junction didn't care about the details. The town just needed a story to tell each other. Miles stood outside the post office, gazing at the bulletin board covered in old scraps of paper. He understood that this town survived because of its close-knit community, and that same community could stifle anyone who deviated from its pattern. Evelyn did nothing wrong, neither did he. But that doesn't matter anymore. Miles began to doubt himself. Not in a weak way, but in the way of a seasoned man, knowing that good intentions don't always lead to good results. Helping others is a responsibility he used to believe. Now he has another question. What is the right way to help? He thought of Evelyn sitting alone in the empty house, the two little chairs no longer there. He thought of the children forced to leave, not because of poverty, but because the adults weren't kind enough to keep quiet. Clearwater Junction remains awake. Awake to observe. Awake to judge. Awake to reassure itself that everything is proceeding in the right order. Miles walked for a long time that night. Not to find answers, but to accept that the question had changed. Perhaps the hardest thing wasn't doing the right thing, but knowing when to stop, when to step back and leave room for others. In Clearwater Junction, the oil lamps went out one by one. But the stories didn't. They continued to live quietly like the heartbeat of a town that never truly slept. And while Miles Rowan is still wondering whether he should move forward or backward, Clearwater Junction will force everyone to confront an unprepared event where all hesitation will come too late. Accidents never knock. They just appear at the very moment people believe they've had enough. That afternoon at Ironwood Flats was unremarkable. A gentle breeze swept across the dry grass, carrying the smell of rust from the old barn near the railroad tracks. Samuel Price was in the backyard repairing the fence that had fallen over the previous winter. He heard footsteps, light-hurried, then an unwanted sound, a sharp, short clang of metal. He turned around abruptly. Eli Price lay motionless near the abandoned freight car, his small body twisted to one side, blood seeping into the dry earth. There was no crying, no calling for his mother. Only a terrifying silence, the kind of silence that lets adults know things have spiraled out of control. Samuel ran to him, knelt down, called his son's name. His hand trembled as he touched Eli's forehead, colder than usual. Too cold. "Is anyone there?" he shouted, his voice breaking in the vast empty air. Ironwood Flats answered with the wind. Everything that followed unfolded like fragmented pieces of a memory one would never want to recall. A carriage arrived. A man held the child's head. Another ran to call a doctor. Samuel couldn't remember what he had done. He only remembered the feeling of his son's small hand growing in his, not from weakness, but from life slipping away. Margaret Price arrived as darkness began to fall. She didn't cry immediately. She looked at Eli, at the blood at his pale face, and then her whole body collapsed, as if finally allowed to let go. They took Eli to the town's only clinic, a small wooden house with a dimly burning oil lamp. The doctor hadn't returned yet. When he arrived, he looked at the child, at the wound, then at Margaret. "We need surgery immediately," he said, as if making an announcement. Without emotion, without hesitation. That but fell as heavy as a stone. "You have to pay in advance." Margaret looked at him. She didn't understand. She didn't want to understand. "I'll pay," she said. "Later. I beg you. Please." The doctor shook his head. Not harsh, not cruel. Just used to this order. "I can't," he replied. "You know the rules." Samuel stood behind, his mind blank. He rummaged through his pockets. A few silver coins. Not enough. Never enough. Margaret knelt down, not out of weakness, but because she had no other choice. "Please," she said, her voice hoarse. "He's my son." The doctor turned away as if unable to bear that gaze. Ironwood Flats taught people how to endure, but it didn't teach them how to look directly at the suffering of others when the rules stood in the middle. Eli breathed with difficulty. Each breath was like pulling a thin thread from his mother's hand. Margaret took his little hand and whispered not a prayer but everyday words as if life went on. "It's Mom. It's okay. Can you hear me?" Samuel stood there, feeling utterly useless for the first time in his life. The risk of losing my child was no longer just a thought. It was present. Sitting in that room, counting every minute. Outside, Ironwood Flats remained quiet. No one knew. No one heard. The town wasn't bad, it just wasn't built to react quickly enough to tragedies like this. When Eli began to twitch slightly, Margaret screamed, "Don't call the doctor. Don't call God. Just call his name." That moment, no one could ever forget it. No one in that room. And just when things seemed to have crossed a point of no return, a shadow appeared at the doorstep. Samuel turned his head. His heart was pounding. It wasn't a miracle. It was just a person who came along at the right time when all hesitation had become meaningless. And as the clinic door closes behind the person who just entered Ironwood, Flats will witness the moment when ethics is no longer an abstract concept. It is placed squarely on the scales where no one has the right to stand aside. The clinic at Blackstone Ridge was shrouded in a heavy silence, not the silence of healing but the silence of decisions that had been delayed for too long. The oil lamp cast a pale yellow light on the gray wooden walls where time had etched itself into tiny cracks. Caleb Turner leaned against the wall, his hands clasped, feeling the pounding of his heart in his ears. On the narrow bed, Jonah Turner lay motionless, his breathing shallow and rapid. Each rise and fall of his chest startled Sarah Turner, his mother, as if someone were squeezing her. She kept her eyes on her son, no longer weeping. Her tears had dried, giving way to a painful lucidity that only mothers on the brink of losing their child possess. The doctor turned around, notebook in hand. He stood a few steps away from the bed, far enough away so he wouldn't have to look directly into the child's face. "There's a way," he said, his voice, even as if he were talking about fixing a door. "The boy could stay here. Help out, clean. When he's fitter he can do lighter chores. The cost could be deducted gradually." Sarah spun around. "What did you say?" she asked, unable to believe her ears. The doctor shrugged slightly, a gesture of someone accustomed to calling it a solution. "You know, I have to live too. This clinic isn't free." Caleb took a step forward. His blood was boiling. But he didn't yell. He didn't bang the table. Experienced men understand that uncontrolled anger only makes the other person stand firmer. "You're talking about a child," Caleb said, his voice low and stiff as old wood. "A child who just escaped death." "And I'm talking about the cost," the doctor replied. "This world doesn't operate on emotions." Sarah felt her legs tremble. She looked at Jonah, his small hands, the scratches not yet healed. She understood perfectly what the doctor was offering, not work, but a form of captivity. A child being used as collateral for his own life. "No," she said, her voice hoarse but firm. "My child is not a debt." The doctor sighed, as if she were making things difficult for him. "So, do you have any money?" The question fell through the room like a hammer blow. Caleb looked at Sarah. She shook her head very slowly. Not ashamed, not pleading, just the stark truth. Just then the clinic door opened. Not too strong, not too fast, just enough to get people to come back. Harlan McCoy walked in, his coat dusted with road dust, hat in hand. He didn't look at Jonah first. He didn't look at Sarah. He looked straight at the doctor, the gaze of a man who had spent his life distinguishing between law and conscience. "I heard there's a problem," Harlan said. The doctor frowned. "Who are you?" "The payer," Harlan replied. He placed a leather bag on the table. A brief, sharp metallic click echoed from within. "The whole amount, plus any additional charges." The doctor opened the bag. The silver coin gleamed in the oil lamplight. He remained silent. Harlan didn't stop there. "And you will make it clear," he continued, his voice low but leaving no room for interruption, "that there is no labor agreement whatsoever relating to this child. Otherwise, my lawyer in Silver Bend will be very concerned about your conduct." No one in the room had ever heard Harlan McCoy raise his voice, but they knew that when he talked about the law, he wasn't just talking nonsense. The doctor closed the file. He nodded. No argument. No explanation. Sarah slumped into her chair. This time, tears welled up, not from despair but because her body was finally allowed to relax after surviving the worst. Caleb turned to Harlan, his eyes a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "You don't need to," Harlan raised his hand, signaling them to stop. "I'm not doing this for anyone," he said. "I'm doing it because there are lines that must not be crossed." He looked at Jonah, who was now being cared for more carefully by the doctor than before. "This child," Harlan said, "owes no one anything." The room fell silent. The tension was gone. The threat was gone. Only a very old, very rare feeling remained: justice being called by its rightful name. In Blackstone Ridge, people won't talk much about it. The small town doesn't like rehashing moments that put them in the mirror. But in that silence, something changed. Not the system, not the rules, but the moral boundaries redefined more clearly. Harlan put on his hat and turned away. Before leaving the door, he said one sentence, not directed at anyone in particular. "There are times when paying is the cheapest way to keep a society from losing its soul." But when the clinic doors close, and Jonah Turner is safely returned, Sarah Turner will have to face a truth even harder than losing her child, that a mother's self-esteem sometimes has to learn to change shape to protect what matters most. Morning in Maple Crossing arrived slowly, as if the town needed time to recover from what had happened. A thin mist still clung to the wooden roofs. Sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating the bed where Caleb Foster slept soundly, his breathing more even than the night before. Mary Ellen Foster sat by her son's bedside, her hands resting on her knees. She couldn't sleep. Not because of worry anymore, but because a quiet, profound change was taking place within her, more intense than any panic. For years, Mary Ellen believed that the only thing she had left was her self-respect. When her husband died, when she was burdened by debt, when the town began to look at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion, she stood tall. She refused help. She refused offers. She refused kindness if it risked turning her into a woman who had to depend on someone else. She survived because of that. But last night, as Caleb lay on the fragile line between life and death, Mary Ellen came to a truth that left her heartbroken. Self-respect, if placed above the safety of one's child, becomes a form of selfishness. That realization didn't come like a blow. It came like the first light of day, gentle, unreproachful, but undeniable. When Jonathan Hale returned to Maple Crossing at noon, he brought no promises or offers. He simply stood on the porch, took off his hat, and waited. Jonathan had learned that there are moments when the kindest thing to do is to let others speak for themselves. Mary Ellen invited him in. The small kitchen was tidier than usual. On the table was a stack of white paper and a pen neatly placed. Jonathan saw them but didn't ask. She was the one who initiated the conversation. "I've thought a lot," Mary Ellen said. Her voice was strangely calm, not shaky, not defensive. "And I realized that I couldn't be a mother by only thinking of myself." Jonathan listened. He didn't interrupt. "I will accept help," she continued, "but not as a favor." Jonathan looked up, his eyes serious. "I want a deal," Mary Ellen said. "With terms. With paperwork. I will repay in money, or in work, or in whatever way I can. Not because I doubt you, but because I need to know I'm still standing on my own 2 feet. In that quiet kitchen, Jonathan Hale felt a profound sense of respect welling up inside him, not pity, but acknowledgement. "You don't need to prove anything to me," he said. "I know," Mary Ellen replied, "but I need to prove it to myself." They sat down, not facing each other, but side by side, as if both looking in the same direction. Jonathan took out his papers and began to write. The terms were clear, no ambiguity, no hidden power. Each line was a commitment. Helping did not mean controlling. Mary Ellen read every word carefully. When she signed, her hand didn't tremble. Because that signature wasn't a surrender, it was a mature decision. Jonathan put the papers in a leather folder. "I respect this," he said, "and I will keep my word." Mary Ellen nodded. She rose and poured tea. A small, familiar gesture, but in that moment it signified the restoration of balance. That afternoon, Mary Ellen sat by her son's bedside. Caleb opened his eyes, weak but alert. She held his hand and smiled. "Mom's here," she said. Not a promise. It was a fact. Outside the window, Maple Crossing was the same, but inside that house, something had changed. No noise, no need for witnesses. A mother had learned to allow herself to help without losing her dignity. And Jonathan Hale, stepping out onto the porch, understood that this was the most enduring form of love. Not salvation, not possession, but companionship with complete respect. And as Maple Crossing entered its calmer days, with no more grand promises being spoken, only a quiet question remained. Could these two wounded souls give each other a belated chance, slow enough not to hurt but real enough to live out the rest of their lives together? Autumn arrives at Hawthorne Bend, with subtle changes. The maple leaves on the patio change color more slowly than usual. A gentle breeze blows just enough to carry the scent of dry wood and damp earth. There are no signs of anything major happening, and that's precisely why this moment has its own unique beauty. The wooden house at the end of the gravel road, Willow House, lit up again after years of silence. Not dazzling, not ornate, just a soft yellow light enough to let people know that someone was living inside. Anna Whitfield placed the kettle on the stove, listening to the gentle hum of the boiling water. She was no longer in a hurry. Her movements carried the serenity of someone who had learned to live slowly, not because she was running out of time, but because she appreciated each day that remained. Outside, Benjamin Crow was repairing a leaning wooden fence. He worked alone, but not alone. Each plank was placed in its proper position, no more, no less, just as he had approached life since returning to Hawthorne Bend, doing what needed to be done and stopping at the right time. The children ran across the yard, their laughter not loud or boisterous but soft, even like a gentle stream. They didn't know the whole story that had brought this family back to Willow House, and they didn't need to know. What mattered was that they were here, where they had a roof over their heads, a warm dinner, and adults sober enough to listen. Anna stood in the doorway watching the scene. She didn't feel saved, nor did she feel indebted. She was simply a woman who had experienced enough loss to understand that staying wasn't a favor but a shared choice. Benjamin put down the hammer and wiped his hands on a towel. He looked at Anna. He said nothing. Neither of them sought confirmation from the other. They had moved past that stage. There was no wedding, no rings, no promises were made in front of witnesses. There were only small practical agreements. Whoever woke up earlier would light the fire. Whoever came home late would leave their meal behind. Expenses were clearly documented, and limits were respected. They don't call it love. They call it a way of life. In the evening, the whole family sat around the old wooden table. The meal was simple. No one recounted old stories. No one mentioned the dark days. Not because they had forgotten, but because there was no need to bring them up to prove anything anymore. Benjamin talked about the weather. Anna talked about the weekend market. The children asked very common questions. Do they have school tomorrow? Will they get to go to the stream this weekend? Life goes on, quietly, properly. After dinner, Anna went out onto the porch and put on a sweater. The moon was high in the sky, casting a silvery light over Hawthorne Bend, a town that had witnessed enough heartbreak, enough rumors, enough headshakes. Now it needed no more words. Benjamin stepped back and stood beside her. Not touching, not too close. Just enough distance for both of them to feel comfortable. We don't know what the future holds, Anna said very softly. Benjamin nodded. But I know we'll wake up here tomorrow. That's enough. Neither of them believed that everything would be perfect. They had lived long enough to not need such illusions. But they also knew that kindness, when repeated every day, creates a different kind of lasting bond. Willow House didn't return to its former state. It returned in a new form, simpler, less boisterous, but more authentic. The walls no longer held the old laughter. They held the present footsteps, slow, steady, and deliberate. In Hawthorne Bend, this wouldn't be called a happy ending. And perhaps they don't even need to call it one, because some stories never end. They just soften and become truer. The story of Caleb Turner and Margaret Turner is not a fairy tale. It has no wedding, no vows of eternal love, and no perfect ending in the conventional sense. But precisely because of that, it is very real and very close to our lives. Perhaps the biggest lesson this story leaves us with is, kindness is only truly valuable when it is accompanied by respect. Caleb didn't save Margaret. He didn't portray himself as a hero. He understood that sometimes the hardest thing isn't helping, but helping without hurting someone's self-esteem. Margaret also didn't learn to be dependent. She learned to allow herself to be helped, but with clear conditions, clear boundaries, and with her dignity preserved. At an age when many of us have experienced loss, mistakes, and irreversible turning points, this story reminds us that it's never too late to live a better life. It's never too late to fix the way we love. A late opportunity, but not too late. Not to start over, but to do the rest better. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If you see a part of yourself in Caleb or Margaret, please like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel to join us on our next stories. Slow-paced human stories, deep enough to make us feel less alone on our journey through life. See you again in another quiet story.